Weddings are supposed to be one of the happiest days of a person's life, but why do they then also typically end up being one of the most stressful? From the cost, problematic traditions, and even from the extremely high expectations that a lot of people put on typical Western weddings, it can often leave a lot to be desired and can sometimes leave people feeling underwhelmed or wishing that they had gone about getting married in a different way. Now, before we go ahead and get too far into this video, I do just need to preface that this video is primarily going to be focused on the typical Western wedding. I just need to say that because I know there are so many different kinds of weddings that happen all over the different worlds depending on cultures and ethnicities and where in the world you're located, but I am coming from a Canadian perspective with the typical Western wedding in mind, with the white dress and the ceremony and the reception and all that jazz. Now, when it comes to a typical Western wedding, there are a lot of things that people come to expect. Before you even have the wedding, you have a bachelor and a bachelorette party, a bridal shower. Then for the actual wedding, you have the ceremony, a dinner, and a reception. The bride is in a beautiful white dress. And there are just so many different traditions that take place during a wedding like this. But I feel like a lot of people don't really know where a lot of these traditions got their start. And a lot of these traditions do not exactly have a happy or positive origin, to put it lightly. The first tradition that we are going to talk about that I think most people are pretty familiar with is the tradition of getting engaged and getting an engagement ring, which even I do in fact have. I'm a big fan of very pretty, very sparkly, but most people who intend to get married get engaged and get an engagement ring. But do you know the backstory of the engagement ring and where it comes from? The American Gem Society states that the tradition of an engagement ring is thought to stem from the Roman custom in which wives wore rings attached to small keys indicating their husband's ownership. Now, as a woman in the year 2023, I'm gonna be honest, I don't love the idea of a ring being tied to, I don't know, my ownership? I don't know about you, but I'm not personally a big fan of that. I am also aware, though, that unfortunately a big part of the origin of marriage to begin with has to do with the ownership and wives basically being their husband's property. And unfortunately, that's not the first time this is going to be brought up in today's video talking about wedding traditions. And speaking of, we can go ahead and move on to our next problematic tradition, which is that of fathers walking their daughters down the aisle to be given away. In practice, I think a lot of people look at this as like a very sweet moment between a father and daughter, but when you really do look at the origin of it, it's really not a happy thing, at least not for the woman in question. Insider.com states that the tradition of a father of the bride walking his daughter down the aisle to give her away roughly dates back to 1549. It was more of a business transaction than anything else, as the giving away referred to the transfer of property. In Britain, as in many places, women had long been considered essentially the property of men, first their fathers and then their husbands. The phrase give away suggests a lot about the woman's role in this exchange from one man to another. You know, I don't even think I really need to explain why that is just a horrendous tradition, and I myself am not a fan of it. And that being said, I do think the meaning of the tradition has changed and shifted over the years, and it's no longer so much of a transfer of property from one man to another with the bride being given away so much, but I think a lot of people really just look at it nowadays as like a sweet thing, which I think it can be nice, you know, a thing between like a father and daughter, but overall, I just don't love the backstory of it, and I think it's pretty obvious why. Another very common tradition that we see at a lot of weddings nowadays that has a very surprising backstory that I actually didn't know about until researching for this video is the backstory of a groom having a best man. Turns out that it did not just start as a representation of this person who was close to the groom that they wanted beside them on their big day, but it actually started out as more of a physical role. Insider.com says the best man originated as the groom's choice protector. Many centuries ago, it was common for a groom to steal a bride from her family if they didn't approve of the union, and it was the best man's job to fight off the family if they retaliated. Yeah, I have to say that was not an origin I expected. Had no idea. Also, wild. Can you imagine? Society back in the day seems like a really wild place, and I'm very glad that I live in the year 2023. I'm not gonna lie, very happy to be here in modern times. Now, obviously, I won't go ahead and get into every single wedding tradition in today's video because there are just too many wedding traditions out there in Western weddings to count. But the final one we are going to talk about in this video is one that I'm definitely glad is not as common anymore because, oh boy, this one, oh, it has a backstory, a very uncomfortable backstory. The tradition I'm talking about is the garter toss. That is right, that really awkward, uncomfortable tradition where the bride sits down on a chair just surrounded by the crowd of her and her now husband's friends and family, and they all watch and stare as her new husband comes in, takes a garter off from her leg, from under her dress, and he throws it into the crowd or something? I've never seen a garter toss IRL, and I really hope that I never do. But basically, the backstory of the garter toss is... An article from Mike.com reads, "The tradition comes from the Middle Ages when the newlywed couple would immediately leave the wedding for a separate room to consummate their marriage. Unfortunately, the consummation wasn't exactly private. In some countries, you needed a witness for it to be official. According to the Chicago Tribune, this tradition continued well into the 18th century for royal European couples who would select guests to escort them to their chambers." Basically, the garter toss originated when a few witnesses would get a little too enthusiastic about the action and grab the bride's clothes as she walked by. Eventually, as Mental Floss reports, people realized how utterly creepy this was, so instead the groom would remove an undergarment and toss it outside to prove the consummation to the witnesses. The garter toss is now essentially proof that the bride has been deflowered in a very public setting. Not exactly empowering. Now, knowing the history of the garter toss, I can just not imagine willingly standing in front of all of your friends and family and wanting to participate in something like that. I don't know about you, but I think that's incredibly uncomfortable. Alongside the actual marriage itself being something to work towards and aspire to have, the actual wedding day itself has been made such a major event in people's lives and such a huge thing that we're taught to aspire to have and work towards. There's oftentimes a lot of pressure put on newly engaged couples to have this big, extravagant fairy tale wedding. Sometimes it can just be the societal pressure of, oh, you're engaged, you're gonna get married, this is what you are supposed to do. You are supposed to throw this huge party. Or sometimes engaged couples also face pressure from friends and particularly family to throw these big extravagant weddings. I've heard of so many stories from couples who originally wanted to have a pretty small intimate wedding, but their parents who were helping them pay for the wedding decided that they wanted it to be a much bigger, extravagant event with every single distant friend and family being invited, and all of a sudden this couple's once small, intimate, relaxed wedding becomes this huge event that just becomes incredibly stressful. They just don't enjoy it as much because it's not exactly what they wanted, because they felt that pressure from those around them to throw this wedding that the people around them thought they needed to have, when in reality that wasn't even the wedding they wanted. I think dealing with all of this pressure to have a big, expensive wedding can often lead to a lot of couples feeling big regret about how they had their wedding, whether they spent too much money to try to make it an absolutely perfect day, or they spent all of their time and effort trying to make other people happy, whether it was trying to make their parents and family happy or all of their guests in general happy. A lot of people can oftentimes find themselves catering to other people's wants when it comes to their wedding, more so than their own wants. And then, you know, they have their wedding day, they spend all this money, and then they didn't even really get a chance to enjoy it. Their big day, their wedding, and they couldn't even focus on themselves. They focused on everyone else. I think that due to the combination of the extreme pressure to have a perfect wedding, the horrible origin of a lot of the wedding traditions we see, and also just the absolutely outrageous prices we see when it comes to literally anything related to weddings, we can see a big shift happening within the wedding industry. Now, obviously, we are still seeing a ton of people opt for that more classic, traditional, big, extravagant wedding route that is costing them tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single event. But I think we're also starting to see a little bit of a shift with a lot more people opting to go for a smaller event, whether it just be a more intimate, smaller affair, eloping, or even just going to the courthouse. I think a lot of these much more smaller events are becoming much more popular amongst people nowadays. In a national survey to over 1,000 US-based couples who are currently engaged, the results found that 62% of them are open to considering a scaled-back elopement-style wedding, and the number is higher for females at 69%. Modern couples are motivated by elopements because of the cost efficiency and intimacy of the environment. In a world where everything is consistently going up in price, from groceries, gasoline, housing, and pretty much everything else at this point as well, most couples just can't exactly justify the cost of a big wedding, or even a wedding in general most of the time. Weddings can be so incredibly expensive even if you don't have the huge fancy wedding, but even a basic wedding can cost a ton of money. The Knot.com broke down the average cost of a wedding in the United States and found that it can cost around $30,000. Average wedding. Nothing super fancy, an average wedding. $30,000. What? Even for a couple who is living very comfortably, I feel like $30,000 is just a mind-blowing amount of money to spend on a single day. I myself, as someone who is engaged, I just cannot imagine spending around $30,000 on a singular day for the wedding. I just really can't. And I know that a lot of people, of course, do have weddings for much less than $30,000. By no means have to spend anywhere near that to have a lovely wedding. Even when it does come to much smaller, cheaper weddings, basically anything that is related to a wedding, it's nearly guaranteed to cost a little bit more. Okay, maybe I shouldn't say it's guaranteed to cost a little bit more, but it's been proven that a lot of businesses will charge you more if you say something is for a wedding than if you say it's for another kind of event. A report from CBC News shared an experiment in which they sent multiple groups of people to various venues, florists, and other services related to weddings to inquire about their wedding-related services. They then sent more groups of people to these same locations to inquire about the exact same services for a non-wedding related event. They found that 3 out of 4 venues charged more for a wedding than another type of event with the exact same guest count. 2 out of 4 florists charged more for a wedding than for the same kind of flower centerpiece, and every single limousine company charged more for a wedding than any other kind of event. Now, clearly, there's an upcharge that a lot of businesses feel comfortable putting on their services when it comes to charging for a wedding that they wouldn't necessarily charge if it was the same service for a non-wedding related event. And when doing research for this, there were a lot of people who did say that a lot of businesses have reasons for upcharging a wedding, stating that sometimes the services when being used for a wedding needs more care and it needs more attention to detail. But if you are genuinely looking for the exact same service and you are willing to pay a price, why does the wedding need to cost more? Does that mean that when you are booking that service for any other kind of event, they're not doing their best work? They reserve that best work for the upcharge of the wedding? And if that's the case, why not just charge everyone the same price and give everyone the exact same attention to detail and care as you would a wedding? I don't know. I really don't like the way that the wedding industry upcharges everything like that, and I think it can definitely be a little predatory just to try to get people to spend much more money than they need to on something that is already so horrendously expensive. I do think that oftentimes this upcharge in price is really just taking advantage of people, and I don't like it. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan. At the end of the day, I do have to go ahead and acknowledge that I did primarily talk about very negative things in regards to weddings in this video, but do not get me wrong, I do not hate weddings, and in fact, I actually really love them. I love attending weddings. I just love like having an excuse to get all dressed up and go to a formal event. I think they can be very fun. And I'm also not super against like having big, extravagant, expensive weddings if that's something you really want and can afford. I don't think that will happen for myself, but if I could, I would. If I had that much money to just throw around on a single day event, I probably would. I don't, so I won't. But if I could, I would. But basically what I'm trying to say is that in this video, I'm not by any means trying to shame anyone for having the big, fancy, extravagant weddings. And of course, I'm not trying to shame anyone or judge anyone for following some of the traditions that I mentioned in this video. I mean, obviously, like, I can't really judge too harshly. The first tradition I talked about, like, I have one. So I'm not judging anyone by following those traditions, even if I do think some of them are still quite sexist and problematic. They are just very traditional things that I feel like a lot of people oftentimes probably don't think about the origin from. And I think it's good to know about the origin of these things so that you can really know and understand them when you are making the decision to, you know, plan your own wedding and be able to take that into account. As someone who is currently engaged and starting to think about my own wedding and what I do and don't want in regards to it, this is really a topic that I was really curious about and something that I wanted to dig a little deeper in, and so I thought, hey, why not make a video on the whole thing? And now we're here. And obviously, I barely scratched the surface in a lot of topics related to weddings. There are so many other traditions out there we could have discussed and aspects to weddings that could have been mentioned, but I didn't want the video to be 2 hours long. So, you know, we're keeping it short and sweet and scratching the surface, and maybe we'll talk about other topics related to it later, maybe not, who knows. But anyways, what are your thoughts on weddings? Do you think they're worth it? And if you yourself are married, what was your wedding day like? Do you have any regrets associated with your wedding day? Or if you could do it all over again, would you still do everything the same way? Let me know in the comments down below, and I will see you in my next video. I hope you have a good one. Bye!